Alright, last time we created our model class. And by the way, I noticed there's a couple bugs in that already. For one, I noticed when we pick our random numbers, we were picking random numbers between 0 and max minus 1, when really our random numbers should be between 1 and max. So I'm going to go ahead and just fix that there. And similarly, when we set the maximum number, we may have to pick new numbers. So what I'm going to do is if max is not equal to n, then I'm going to go ahead and set the max and go ahead and at that point pick all new numbers at that point. So we want to make sure that we don't get the inconsistency that one of the numbers is greater than the max. So anyway, so that's our fix. So there we just created our class to hold our lucky numbers. That's going to be our model class, and so we'll create an instance of that later. So what I'm going to do now is actually create our controller. So we've created our view objects, which are stored in our nib file. We just created the class for our model, and now we're going to let's go ahead and create our controller. And so I'm going to create a new class for the controller, and I'm going to go ahead and go to new file, and I'm going to create a new class, and again it's just going to be a subclass of NSObject, and I'm going to call it my controller, and off we go. Create that, add that in. You can see that just creates an empty object for us, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the nib file now. So my class not very interesting at this point, but I'm going to go into the nib file. And I'm actually going to create an instance of the controller and put it in the nib file. So I'm going to go to my object library. I'm going to go down to where I see, scroll down until I see just a vanilla object here. So make sure you don't pick object controller. You want just a vanilla object. So this is just a really vanilla object. And I'm going to place this in my nib file. So I'm actually going to take this, I'm going to drag it, and I'm going to drop it right there. So there it's in my nib file, but I'm actually so this is actually an instance of NSObject that's been serialized and placed in the nib file. So I'm actually going to, with that selected, I'm going to go over to the identity inspector, and I'm going to change its class name to my controller. And just boom, by doing that, now I've got an instance of my controller that's been freeze-dried and placed into the nib file. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to pop over with that selected. I'm going to pop over into what we call tuxedo mode. So if you notice the editor, there's different modes of the editor. I'm going to pop into what I call tuxedo mode. I kind of like this to be side by side, so I'm going to go to view, assistant editor, change it to look like that. There we go. So notice, so I've got sort of my editor split into two pieces here. On the left, I've got the interface builder editor, and on the right, I have an instance of my controller. So now what I need to do is I need to create connections between the objects in my nib file and my controller. So, for instance, one of the things we're going to need to have access to is our six buttons. So one way to do this is if I'm going to take, while holding the control button down, I'm going to drag from one of my buttons and just go over to here, and so we're just going to say insert, and what I want here is an outlet. So as an outlet, I'm going to give this outlet, I'm going to call it button 0, not being very creative. So there's my first outlet. And so I'm going to do this for all 6 buttons. Well, I'll do it again for another button. Again, make sure this is on outlet, and I'll call this button 2. Right. So, if you're interested, I could also be doing this from here as well. You can create the outlet there. This will be button. Oops, I misnamed that other one. So this is actually button 3. So I misnamed this one. So what do you do when you misname something? I guess I go over here and rename them here, and then go into my controller M and reset them here. That fixes those problems. All right, so go back to my controller H, and oh boy, we've got some issues here. All right, well, let me go ahead and set up the other buttons here, buttons 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to control reg there. I'll call this, this is actually button 3. I can fix these later. So I'm going to button 4 and button 5. So those are some outlets. I'm also going to need, let's see, we're going to need an outlet for this matrix too as well. And not in Xbox, I want it actually from the matrix. Actually, I'm going to leave that one alone just for the moment. Let's go ahead and, I know we've got some of these fouled up. So what I'm actually going to do is go back to the normal editor, and I'm going to select my controller, and over here I'm going to click these. So I'm going to actually reset these connections. So over here in the connections inspector, so I'm going to rehook these up. So by just dragging from here, so you can always go into the connections inspector and rehook these up. So that I actually have access to these buttons, so I can actually set the numbers on these buttons. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that like that. Now I'm going to go back and save my controller, go back into the nib file, and go back into tuxedo mode. And so now, so those are outlets. So these give me instance variables, so I can actually talk to these buttons. My controller can connect to these buttons. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up actions. So I want to know when the user clicks these buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to control drag from here, and this time, instead of creating an outlet, I'm going to change it to an action. And I'm just going to call this button click, not being very creative. And I'll say connect. So that's the button that's clicked. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same action for all 6 buttons. So to distinguish the buttons, I'm going to go into, and with each button selected, I'm going to go through, and you're going to see there's an integer tag. We can set the tag for each button. So I'm going to go ahead and set for button 0, I'm going to leave the tag at 0. But for button 1, I'm going to set the tag to 1. For button 2, I'm going to set the tag to 2. And so on and so forth. So I'm going to, that way I'll be able to distinguish which of the buttons it was that sent me the message without having to create an action method for every button. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to control drag the rest of these to that same action. So there we go. So by control dragging, those now should be all connected to the same action. Now I'm also going to need an action for when the big button is collected. So that's going to be the pick all button. Pick all button clicked. And similar, I'm going to want to know when my max value changed, so the values in that matrix. So I'm actually going to select the matrix, and I'm going to control drag from the matrix into here, and I'm going to have an action for that, and that's going to be, I'll call it level selected. There, and that'll hook that up, and there we go. We'll stop at that. Now, if one of these gets screwed up, if you always go out of tuxedo mode, go back. So let's go and save these files. If you go back into the nib file and select your controller and go to, you can see you can always rehook all these things up. right now. So if you go into our controller now, you'll see that it went ahead and, oh, we're also going to need one for yeah, that's fine. So every time an individual button is clicked or when the level is selected. Oh, we screwed up here. I didn't need the pick all button as an outlet, actually. So I'm going to erase that. And I'm going to go into my controller and get rid of that synthesize command. That's not what I meant. What I actually meant is go back into the nib file editor. I actually meant the pick all button. I wanted an action. I must have not selected an action. So pick all button clicked. Connect that up. All right, great. And go ahead and save these files. Go back into the normal editor. I'm going to go back into the nib file, make sure everything looks good. I'm going to select my controller. Yeah, so this pick all, we got rid of this, so you can see a little exclamation point. So I'm just going to whack that there so the nib file doesn't think. So, all right, so going back into my controller, you can see now we've got the methods that are hooked up. So let's just make sure these methods are hooked up correctly. I'm just going to, what I like to do is just be able to log these to the debugger console. So the button clicked. We'll go ahead and print that. So actually what I would like to do in this case is fetch the actual tag of the button that was clicked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say sender tag, and I'm going to log fact that was tagged, and I'm going to go ahead and log that level selected was indeed called, and the pick all button, so it's going to log that, and this will confirm that all this stuff is hooked up correctly. There we go. So, all right, so let's go ahead and run our app at this point. It's off and running. Built. So there we have it. I'm going to go ahead and switch so the debugger is showing. And so I click on button 0, button 1, button 2, and I can see that I'm getting the tag for the correct button, which is good. Pick all button clicked, and so whenever the level selected is selected, I'm getting called. So great. So everything's set up there, and so my controller is, I've created my controller, and everything's hooked up. So that's where the logic of our program will actually go. So the things we have left to do is we need to actually create an instance of our Lucky's Numbers model object, and we need to actually set everything up so we can change the titles on our buttons. So we'll do that in the next video.